This video will spoil every charm from the Pale Court mod, but none of the bosses. It's been a long time coming, but today will finally be the day we take a look at every charm from the Pale Court mod. And if you think this is balanced, you've got another thing coming. I'm Holland, and these are the Pale Court charms rebalanced. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so back. If you don't know, in my most popular series, I go through and rebalance every charm in Hollow Knight. If you're already familiar with the rules, or you just don't care, feel free to skip to the next chapter. If not, I'll take just a quick minute to fill you in. At the top of the description will be a link to the series if you still haven't watched it or just need a refresher, although this video is perfectly understandable without having watched the other episodes. When comparing the Pale Court charms to those from the base game, I'll be referring to my rebalanced versions, and I'll show you a charm card like this to keep you up to speed. Lastly, despite what you might have thought after watching yesterday's video, I actually like Pale Court quite a lot. It's a superb mod and you should totally consider playing it for yourself. I'm a judgmental person by nature, but when I'm being highly critical of something, just know that it's usually out of love for that thing. So if anyone who has worked on Pale Court is watching, I love you and I love the mod you've built. And even though perfect charm balance might not have been your primary goal, it is the goal of this series. So let's see what we can do to make Pale Court even better than it already is. Number 1. King's Honor. First up, we have the only charm in the mod that isn't entirely new, but instead an upgrade to an old one. Now, if you know my stance on fragile charms, you'll know that I'm not a huge fan of upgraded charms, because they're quite hard to balance. Either you make the original version too weak or the final version too strong, and it's kind of hard to have an in-between. You might say, well, Holland, not every charm should be equally powerful, but that is nonetheless the goal of this series. However, with that said, I quite like this charm. It's an upgraded version of the Defender's Crest with a few marked improvements. According to Vegathron on YouTube, the King's Honor has a higher spawn rate, larger effect size, and double the damage of the original Defender's Crest. Notably, it now also infects enemies, which will then spread the plague to other enemies, making the effect feel way more potent. All in all, considering that the charm still costs only one notch, the King's Honor is an obvious improvement to the Defender's Crest, easily being more than twice as powerful as its vanilla counterpart. And personally, while I think the charm is a lot of fun to use, the difference between the two versions feels a little too much. Now, in the original charm rebalancing series, I did buff the Defender's Crest quite significantly, giving it a larger radius along with a special debuff that made enemies infected by the cloud take 15% more damage from all sources. I did that not only to improve the charm's power level, but also to make it somewhat more interesting to use. Now, instead of just being passive damage, you preferably want to capitalize on the debuff by attacking weakened enemies. And I think that makes the charm a tad more engaging. So with that in mind, let's do this. Solution. King's Honor now deals the same amount of damage as the Defender's Crest. Additionally, enemies infected by the crest take 15% more damage from all other sources. Alright, so the goal was to bring the charm a little closer to the power level of the Defender's Crest, which, remember, I have buffed so as not to make it completely useless like it is currently. That means I'm not touching the size increase, since I already gave that to Defender's Crest. The increased spawn rate of clouds will also remain, and I would even consider transferring that to Defender's Crest as well. And then finally, to make the King's Honor a bit less mindless, I'm giving it the Defender's Crest debuff, making enemies take more damage while infected by the cloud. What do these changes accomplish? Well, they lower the discrepancy between the upgraded and non-upgraded version of the charm. Moreover, they take some of the raw power from the King's Honor and place it in the debuff, which should hopefully make the charm feel more engaging. In short, this means that besides the visual change, all the King's Honor does differently than the Defender's Crest is allow the clouds to spread to nearby enemies. That does mean it's still significantly stronger than the Crest, although not by a ridiculous amount, and I think I'm fine with that. Next charm. Number 2. Mark of Purity. You might think I was being a little too harsh on the King's Honor. After all, how overpowered can an upgraded version of Defender's Crest really be? Well, compared to the next charm in the roster, King's Honor might as well be Heavy Blow, because holy moly is Mark of Purity an insane charm. Simply put, Mark of Purity is a slightly more demanding Quick Slash with way more potential. And yes, they stack together. Look at this footage. Who thought to themselves, ah yes, this looks balanced? Instead of giving you a set increase to your attack speed, like Quick Slash, Mark of Purity ramps up in power as you keep attacking enemies. And as long as you get a successful hit every 3.4 seconds and don't take any damage, the effect will never go away. According to the wiki, the charm has a synergy with Nailmaster's Glory, which increases the successive hit window by 0.6 seconds, which is a bit strange to me. We'll get to that. Now, Mark of Purity does apparently decrease your damage by 20% to compensate for this insane increase in attack speed. But I have to be honest, it does not feel like nearly enough of a downside. Especially considering the crazy amount of soul you get from using the charm. So in short, the main problem is that, by my estimation, the charm is way too powerful at 3 notches, and given the synergistic effects it has with both strength and Quick Slash, there's a huge incentive to just put on these 3 charms and call it a day. Now I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, oh well, just increase the damage reduction penalty and keep the attack speed. No, I'm sorry, but no. Because I don't think the problem is just that the charm is too powerful, it's also that it feels way too good to use. Man, look at this footage. This is an excessive amount of dopamine. I know I'm gonna sound like the king of downers, but I think this is honestly too much fun. With such a high attack speed, you're just gonna end up making every other charm combo feel way too boring. So I apologize, but I'll have to make a few radical changes. Solution. Mark of Purity now only slightly increases your attack speed on each consecutive hit. However, the charm also no longer decreases your nail damage when equipped. And finally, combining Mark of Purity with Quick Slash now only makes the buff last longer, stealing that property from Nailmaster's Glory. Now you're no longer heavily incentivized to combine Mark of Purity with Quick Slash. And overall, given the primary change, the dopamine craze has calmed down just a bit. Obviously, given that Mark of Purity requires more effort to use, it should still be potentially stronger than Quick Slash, and at max charge, that remains the case. Also, given that I removed the damage penalty from Mark of Purity to make the charm more simple and less reliant on the extremely high attack speed, the charm should still feel powerful. Also, keep in mind that I basically cut the power of Quick Slash in half during the original series, which means Mark of Purity has less to live up to. Even though you might be cross with me for nerfing your favorite charm, I think you have to admit that the Mark of Purity is way too strong in its current state. Although man, it's fun to use. Number 3. Vessel's Lament. Finally, we can actually get to buffing a charm. But before that, let me quickly remind you that for the past 7 days, I've been uploading a Hollow Knight video every single day. This is the final piece in the 7-day sprint, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't go back and watch the installments you missed. And if you're enjoying the video so far, you could also consider subscribing. Thank you so much for the support. Now back to the Vessel's Lament. This charm is actually really cool. Firstly, it has an effect similar to that of Sports Room, creating a damaging aura at your location when using focus that deals 40 damage. But secondly, each time you hit an enemy, you place a mark on them which lasts until removed. And then, once you focus, a secondary explosion triggers at that enemy's location, dealing 30 damage and removing the mark. It's a super creative charm that feels great to use. I love going around marking enemies before punishing them with focus. And I especially like how consistent the damage is, compared to Sports Room, which is way more finicky. However, I still see a problem here. Because of course I do. When compared to a charm like the Mark of Purity, Vessel's Lament is just a bit it's been underwhelming. Not because the effect isn't awesome, but because it feels like you're doing so much extra work for very little reward. Whereas with Mark of Purity, you just go in, smack the enemy until he perishes. Smack the enemy until he perishes. Whereas with Mark of Purity, you just go in, smack the enemy until he perishes, and that's it. So to encourage the use of these more involved charms like Vessel's Lament, I think we might have to risk over-tuning them just slightly. That's why, in addition to nerfing Mark of Purity, I want to buff the Vessel's Lament. Solution: every explosion now deals 3 times base nail damage, and additionally the size of the main explosion is significantly increased. Currently, Vessel's Lament does 30 damage on the secondary explosions and 40 damage on the main. Making this 3 times nail damage instead bumps it up to 63 damage with the pure nail. That's a lot of damage. In fact, it's about 2 Vengeful Spirits worth. But given the relatively high amount of effort it takes to trigger the effect, I think it's only fair. Oh, and I increased the range of the primary explosion too, just because, not unlike Sports Room, I was finding it hard to actually hit enemies with it. I think you also have to keep in mind that the upsides of Vessel's Lament are pretty hard to capitalize on, mainly that it's able to hit multiple enemies at once. Given that you have to mark each enemy with your nail first, if the enemy is just a petty Colosseum minion, you'll most likely already have killed it before getting to use the charm. It's just too much work for too little reward. And for boss fights, how many targets are you actually hitting at once? 2 maybe when fighting the Watcher Knights. Maybe, but then you also have to find space to heal, which can be tough in many boss fights. But that's not all. If the boss moves just a little too fast, it can easily dodge the secondary explosion. This also happens constantly against teleporting enemies, which is quite a huge downside. And if the boss can stagger, you might try to heal during the stagger only to end up accidentally triggering an explosion and resuming the fight. So all in all, a really cool charm with great potential, which I do think deserves just a slight buff. Oh, and one last thing, something I've talked about before with similar offensive focused based charms like Sports Room and Blood Brew is the following consideration. Perhaps Vessel's Lament should gain a small damage boost, something like, 5 or 10% when used at full health, to encourage actually using focus proactively as well as making the charm more appealing for Radiant runs. Just food for thought. Anyway, moving on. Number 4. Boon of Hollownest. These last 2 charms are probably the most impressive of the entire mod, as well as the most expensive. Pale Court is a very quirky mod in this regard, because it turns out that each charm has a different cost. Clever girl. But if you know me, you'll know that I don't take kindly to charms costing more than 3 notches. Why? Well, they simply limit your build options too much. The more expensive a charm, the fewer decisions you're allowed to make in your build. And so I prefer to keep prices between 1 to 3 notches, which I'll do here as well. So what does the Boon of Hollownest actually do? Well, at the cost of 4 notches, it transforms each of your spells into pale counterparts. And man, I gotta say, that's pretty cool. Your Vengeful Spirit turns into 3 daggers. Your Howling Wraiths creates explosions similar to the one seen in Vessel's Lament. And your Desolate Dive summons a row of pale blades from the ground. Not only do these abilities look awesome, but they're super fun to play with. Now, I found it pretty difficult to accurately assess the power level of each of the spells. I think you need to play with them quite a lot before it's possible to give an honest opinion on how strong they actually are. From my experiences so far, each of the new spells don't feel that much more impactful than the regular ones. Because even though they do more damage on paper, they each have their own weaknesses. The Soul Daggers can quite easily miss, so can the Soul Blast, which has a very long duration. And the Soul Pillars, we'll get to those in a moment. Also, you have to keep in mind that you're spending 4 notches on this charm, which means a side grade isn't nearly enough to make up for the cost. The new spells have to be stronger than the old, which I think they probably are. But there is one thing I have to comment on, and that is how incredibly disruptive it feels to use the replacement for Desolate Dive, the pillars. Man, I don't know what Pure Vessel has done to my brain, but when I see these giant pale blades, I just freeze. It's like my entire body is screaming, "Don't walk into those." But you can. It's totally fine. You might have just been conditioned to think otherwise by fighting Pure Vessel one too many times. This is actually kind of a problem given just how much of the screen these pillars take up. Which is the other problem. The pillars take up so much space and last for so long that it sometimes feels impossible to see what's going on behind the scenes. This usually ends up getting me killed. With those two complaints in mind, I would suggest the following change. Solution: Boon of Hollownest now costs only 3 charm notches, down from 4. Additionally, the soul pillars are replaced with a new texture and are made to be less visually obstructive. So perhaps that means they go on the backmost sprite layer, or become partly transparent, or last for a shorter duration. Anything like that would really help the experience, at least for a pale court newbie like myself. But maybe I just need to stop complaining and use the charm some more. It might very well be. Anyway, awesome charm. Let's move on. Number 5. Abyssal Bloom. Speaking of awesome charms, finally we have the star of the show, the only charm that isn't completely pale. Now, if you've played the mod before and obtained this charm legitimately, you might very well have mixed feelings about how to acquire the charm. So far, I haven't talked about how to find any of these charms, but just for the Abyssal Bloom, I'll make an exception. First, because it doesn't require spoiling a boss, and second, because gosh darn it, I finally understand why Path of Pain doesn't have any substantial reward at the end. To acquire the Abyssal Bloom, you have to, number 1, put on Dashmaster, number 2, go to a new place in the Abyss, and number 3, then suffer through what is basically a second, and in my opinion, way more frustrating Path of Pain. Now, why is this Path of Pain worse than the original? Well, mostly because we're using Dashmaster, which has the fun and quirky ability to allow you to dash downwards. You'll need the charm to pass through these horizontal shade gates, which also now damage you upon contact. It's a pretty cool mechanic and they're used quite well. However, given just how specific this challenge demands you to be with your inputs, especially on the very last stretch, I found it very easy to accidentally dash downward after a pogo, resulting in a fail state, which felt so frustrating. Don't get me wrong, this challenge had a lot of really creative moments, and at times I even had fun, but the difference between this Path of Pain and the original is massive. Sure, the original is super tough as well and can definitely get frustrating, but it felt more natural to get good at. This one is just... it feels like I'm fighting my own movement inputs more than I'm fighting the actual challenge. If that made no sense, I think you have to try braving the path yourself. Thankfully, it's actually relatively short, which I really appreciated. And at the end, you find the Abyssal Bloom. Just before we get to what the charm does, let me be really honest for a second. I think this charm placement is quite terrible. Sure, there's an argument to be made that, as we'll see in a second, the charm is only really meant for confident players, so you may as well hide it behind a very difficult challenge. But I just don't think that's sufficient reasoning for keeping hundreds, if not thousands of players from legitimately obtaining the charm. I just wanted to get that out there. I'm curious whether or not you agree. Anyway, let's get to what the charm actually does. Here's the Abyssal Bloom's charm card. As you can see, it's pretty packed. A little too packed for my taste, actually. Funnily enough, and I think some of you may have pointed this out before, the Abyssal Bloom does what I made Fury of the Fallen do in my first attempt to rework the charm, which is that it gives you extra damage for every mask lost. Well, in part 5, I ended up reworking the charm again because I thought the lack of a specific cutoff point was actually hurting the charm's design. It's hard to explain exactly why, but there's something about the effect only triggering once you get down to a certain number number of masks that feels way different than the charm just progressively giving you more damage. It's kind of the same thing that I talked about in the progression video, that it might actually feel better to only get the benefit of a mask shard once you've collected 4. So that's one potential problem with the Abyssal Bloom that I'll attempt to remedy. But that's not all the charm does. According to the wiki, Abyssal Bloom provides a 6.25% damage increase for each mask lost, which is bumped up to 9.375% when you have only 1 mask left. Additionally, once you get to about half health, it can be a little more due to some rounding shenanigans, but about half health, your nail strikes turn black, which looks awesome. When this happens, you'll also start to benefit from a 10% increase to your movement speed and a 10% cooldown reduction on your dash. So confusingly, no novel changes to the actual nail, which just turned black. But then finally, once you reach just 1 mask, the movement speed bonus and cooldown reduction goes up to 20% and your attacks gain 75% increased range, with an awesome new visual to boot. Now, if you thought that was a mouthful, so did I. And listen, I get the point. The charm costs 5 notches, you got it after a very tough late game challenge, it does like a million different things, it's supposed to make you feel like a badass. I get that, and I respect it. But my MO is charm balance. It's to make these damn things cost no more than 3 notches, and it's to make them as simple as possible. So forgive me for this, but I'll have to majorly alter the Abyssal Bloom to make it fit within this framework. But don't worry, I think you might actually like this new design. Solution: Abyssal Bloom now costs only 3 charm notches, down from 5, and loses all previous effects. Instead, the charm now increases the range of your nail by 50% at 3 masks, 75% at 2 masks, and 100% at 1 mask. Now hear me out, this change accomplishes a bunch of things. First, it makes the charm simpler, bringing it in line with other Hollow Knight charms while keeping the coolest part intact, the awesome new attack animation. Second, it's now mechanically very similar to my reworked version of Fury of the Fallen, which makes them a great pairing. And finally, it allows Sprint Master and Dash Master to actually feel special again. I get that you want to be the cool kid on the block, Abyssal Bloom, but you can't be good at everything. Especially at your now reduced cost of only 3 notches. Now let me rapid fire through some smaller changes. Right now, the charm works with Joni's Blessing in the most overpowered way, as the blessing allows Abyssal Bloom to act as if you were only at 1 mask, granting you every benefit it has to offer. This doesn't work with Fury of the Fallen, and for good reason. Listen, I buffed Joni's Blessing in a previous episode. Having it work like this is just too much. So this interaction is now gone. Abyssal Bloom apparently doesn't stack with Longnail or Mark of Pride, likely due to the challenge of implementing those synergies. But because that's not a problem for us, I'll say that Abyssal Bloom now stacks with nail size altering charms. And finally, when used in conjunction with Sharp Shadow, the Abyssal Bloom apparently makes you deal even more damage per mask lost. Given the fact that I made the charm no longer increase your damage at all, I'll sadly just have to scrap this synergy. Again, I understand that balance might not have been the main focus when these charms were designed. And no matter how unbalanced they are, I still think they're amazingly fun to use. And the developers deserve endless praise for making them, especially given just how creative each of these concepts are. It might be more helpful to think of this video not as a criticism of Pale Court, but as a what-if scenario. What if Pale Court's charms were made to be just as balanced as the regular Hollow Knight charms? It's an interesting thought. And despite my voice having fought me every step of the way during this video, I really loved going through these charms with you. But you'll have to excuse me, I've got a trader lord who needs smacking around. Thank you so much for watching. In the time it's taken me to create these last 7 videos, my channel has basically died, along with my voice. Which is to be expected, but nonetheless a little sad. So if you want to show your support without spending a penny, I'd encourage you to consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps out a ton. And when I tell you that I want to hear your opinions in the comments below, I don't just say that for purposes of engagement. I say it because I'm basically still only doing this because I love to hear what you people have to say. Supportive, critical or otherwise. But that's all for now. Consider checking out the last 6 videos, all released within the week. And thanks again for trekking along. It's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.